Chapter 37, Section 2. So, when you're looking into the 1920s and 30s, so into this period after World War One, you're going to see a lot of time spent trying to recover from the damages during World War One. And then when you get to the end of the 20s, when you get to 1929, all of a sudden you've got the Great Depression starting and business slows down. And people start questioning their forms of government. Germany, their new leader will threaten world peace. Russia, their new leader will set up the world's first communist nation. So let's take a look at Russia here. Now, Russia was originally called Muscovy. They had a pretty rough history since Ivan the Terrible had died back in 1584. It was called the Times of Trouble. A lot of disorder was happening in Russia, but this Times of Troubles will end in 1613 when 17-year-old Michael Romanov becomes the new czar. His dynasty of rulers is going to rule Russia till 1917. In 1682, the first great Romanov ruler was actually Michael's grandson. He becomes known as Peter the Great. And so 1682, he takes the throne. He wanted Muscovy to be a strong and modern country. And so Peter actually disguises himself as a sailor, and he goes and visits various capitals around the world. He learns Western ways. He's the one that renames Muscovy to Russia. He's going to have factories built, and he's going to have canals built and mines established. He has St. Petersburg built on the Baltic Sea. It's going to be the new capital. This was an ice-free port, and they could trade year-round at St. Petersburg. He revises the alphabet. He sets up schools for the upper class. Trains a powerful army, trains the country's first navy. He changed the way people looked. He ordered men to shave their beards, ordered men to wear European-style short jackets, not long coats that had long been the style in Muscovy and what is now Russia. The next great Romanov ruler is going to be in 1762, Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great, she wanted to improve life for peasants. She even talked about abolishing serfdom, the idea of having serfs. But she might abolish it. Then peasants in the Ukraine actually rebelled, and then the French Revolution happened, and all of this kind of scared Catherine. She didn't want what was happening in France to happen there, so she gave up on the idea to help the peasants. But what she does do, she increases Russia's size. She expanded east, she expanded west, she expanded south. As you get into the 1800s, there's going to be a lot of discontent in Russia. Russia had about 30 million serfs. Remember, Catherine the Great almost gave them their freedom, but then changed her mind. Half of the serfs in Russia were actually owned by the Tsar. These serfs are supporting about 500,000 nobles and clergy. The Tsar controlled all industry, and society was suffering. I mean, students were protesting, peasants were revolting, workers were going on strike. Um, in 1825, there's going to be a revolution by a group of army officers. They had been inspired by the French Revolution and they revolt. The Tsar is able to put it down, though. The Tsar tries to have more control, tries to say, writers can't criticize the government. But the ideas kept spreading. The ideas kept spreading. 1861, finally, when Tsar Alexander II frees the serfs. He was going to try to modernize the country and try to be fair. He didn't give them land, but they were free. So most of them actually become tenant farmers working on the land they had always worked on. And then in 1905, there's going to be another uprising. Thousands of workers are going to appear in front of the Tsar's palace, and they want a national assembly. They want freedom of speech and religion. They want better work conditions. It didn't matter if you were a factory worker or a peasant, you wanted better conditions. Soldiers actually fire on the protesters, and hundreds of unarmed protesters are killed. And so then a strike occurs. People refuse to work after this. And the Tsar does give in to some of their demands, but refuses to let there be a national assembly. Then World War I happens, and World War I is going to make it even worse for the Russians. They're short on factories to make guns. They're short on factories to make ammo. There wasn't enough supplies, or it wasn't enough railroads to get supplies to the front. They had higher casualties than anybody else. They had approximately 9 million killed and wounded in battle. Civilians are suffering from lack of fuel and lack of food. And then in the middle of World War I, in March 1917, there's going to be a revolt. And striking workers are going to jam the streets in St. Petersburg, led by women, because the men were off to war. And they demand peace, and they demand bread. And you're going to have garrisons of military soldiers join in because they refuse to shoot into these crowds. And the revolt spreads to the country, and peasants start to take over land from the nobles. Soldiers leave the front in World War I and they walk back home and protest. The Tsar is going to be forced to abdicate, to give up the throne and run away. And a temporary government will be set up. There's going to be a lot of confusion after the Tsar, Nicholas II, after he is overthrown. Nicholas II and his family are actually shot. There were some reports that they escaped, but him and his family were killed. The Bolsheviks are going to take advantage. This was a revolutionary group led by Vladimir Lenin. And he is going to get support of the Soviets. The Soviets were these committees that represented the workers and represented the soldiers. And he's going to promise them land for the peasants, bread for the workers, and he promises he will get Russia out of this war. In November of 1917, the Bolsheviks take power from that temporary government, and Lenin is chosen to lead. This was the Bolshevik Revolution, and this is where they signed that treaty with Germany and get them out of the war. But this did not solve the troubles at home. Between 1918 and about 1920, there ends up being civil wars at home. You have the Bolsheviks, which were the communists, they were called the Reds, versus the Mensheviks and other non-communists. They're the whites. The U.S. and other countries send supplies to the whites. We did not want to see communism growing and spreading across Europe. You know, the Russians didn't necessarily like the communists necessarily, but they didn't want to return to the old times. And by the time you got to 1921, the whites had been defeated. And so in 1922, you're going to have the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, or the Soviet Union. It's made up of 4 republics. Russia was by far the largest and most powerful. But Russia is not the name of the country at this point. It's the USSR, the Soviet Union. Okay, Russia was just a republic in that country, just like we have states that are in the United States. By the time you get to 1924, the USSR was completely under communist control. But in 1924, Lenin dies, and they embalm his body and put it in a glass coffin. And they actually take Petrograd and rename it Leningrad. Today it's called St. Petersburg. They get rid of that name eventually. But now you've got this power struggle. Lenin's dead. He's the one that led him into all of this. And this power struggle lasts until 1928, when finally Joseph Stalin takes control. Joseph Stalin controlled the only political party in the country, the Communist Party. And he wants to industrialize the Soviet Union. He sets up what's called the 5-year plan. And in this 5-year plan, he's going to have a lot of heavy industry built, so they can manufacture materials and machines. And he has steel mills built, and he has power plants and oil refineries and chemical plants. And it's all kept under the government's control. And workers are paid by how much they produce. And factory managers had to produce a certain amount of goods. And it was all controlled by the government, by Stalin. By the time you get to 1939, the Soviet Union was a major industrial power. But they paid the price for this rapid industrialization. People were working long hours for low wages. The goods they produced were not good quality, and there was actually a shortage of goods. Another goal of Stalin's 5-year plan had been something called collectivization. Collectivization was combining small farms into large ones controlled by the government. And farmers were paid by how many days they work. And they had to share tractors and they had to share machinery. And the government would buy the crops and sell it to buy machines for factories. There were a lot of peasants that weren't happy about this. They wanted to keep their farms. But if you refused to give up your farm, you were either just shot or you were sent to labor camps out in Siberia. It causes a famine in the Ukraine. And they could control the peasants with this famine. People were starving. They weren't producing enough. By the time you get to 1936, most of the farms had been collectivized.